No one on Fort Selden ever forgot the look on his face. The precise moment the lieutenant colonel realized the woman he'd mocked wasn't just another junior officer wandering where she didn't belong, but someone whose authority reached far beyond his own. But before that revelation shattered the quiet arrogance of the morning, before ranks and titles rearranged themselves like falling dominoes, there was only a hallway humming with fluorescent lights and the naive certainty of a man who believed he knew exactly who everyone was. And if you've ever seen someone underestimate the wrong person, you already know where this is headed. Make sure to like and subscribe if you believe respect should be earned through conduct, not assumed by appearance. Because this story begins with a mistake so bold it echoed through an entire division. It started just after 0700 hours, when the base was still shaking off dawn and the towering headquarters building sat wrapped in the quiet authority of steel and glass. Soldiers crisscrossed the courtyard in crisp formation, stepping with that purposeful stride you only earn after years of early mornings, while staff officers moved like currents through the building's double doors, their arms full of binders, tablets, and steaming coffee cups. Inside, the hallway leading to the division briefing room buzzed with the low murmur of pre-meeting chatter, those subtle, knowing exchanges only senior staff understood. That was when she walked in, a young woman in her late 20s, blonde hair pulled neatly back, her posture effortless yet unmistakably self-assured. She carried a leather-bound folder tucked under her arm, her steps measured, smooth, betraying none of the nerves you'd expect from someone approaching a room filled with commanders and full-bird colonels. Most people didn't give her more than a passing glance, but one man did. Lieutenant Colonel Eric Grayson, the kind of officer who had risen through the ranks on a mixture of competence, luck, and an ego that always entered the room half a step before he did, caught sight of her approaching the secured conference area. And with an amused breath through his nose, he shifted his stance just enough to block her path, one polished boot angled in front of the other, the universal posture of someone who believes authority is the same thing as power. "Ma'am," he said, not unkindly but with an unmistakable note of indulgent condescension. "This area is for battalion command staff. The planning brief for junior officers is 2 doors down." She stopped just short of him, her expression calm, her gaze level, not intimidated, not defensive, simply waiting for him to finish speaking. "I'm aware," she replied quietly, but her tone lacked the hesitation he'd expected, and that alone seemed to irk him. He let out a soft chuckle, the kind meant to smooth things over while reinforcing the hierarchy he believed existed. "I admire the enthusiasm," he said. "Really. But this room." He pointed over his shoulder toward the frosted glass door etched with the division's crest. "This is senior leadership only. Brigade commanders, battalion COs, chief staff directors. The big table. You'll get there eventually." She blinked once, slowly, absorbing his words, but her posture remained unchanged, a stillness that didn't signal discomfort, but experience. More experience, perhaps, than he could recognize. She attempted to step around him, and again he shifted subtly, blocking her. "Let me help you out," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Who are you shadowing today? Ops? Logistics? Someone bring you in early." She met his gaze again, her voice steady. "I'm here for the division briefing." A few officers passing by slowed without appearing to. The tension, though quiet, was palpable. Grayson chuckled again, louder this time, glancing around as if expecting others to share the joke. "The division briefing," he echoed, clearly entertained. "Captain, there are protocols, you know. You can't just wander in and hope no one notices. This isn't." He stopped mid-sentence, realizing she wasn't reacting. No embarrassment, no apology, no quick retreat. That bothered him. "Look," he said, dropping the gentle tone. "The big leagues aren't for walk-ins. I don't know who told you otherwise, but you need to step aside. I have work to do." She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, the metallic click of boots on tile echoed from around the corner. Command Sergeant Major Roy Halden, broad-shouldered, steel-eyed, the kind of man who carried the weight of thousands of soldiers in the lines carved into his face, strode into view. Grayson straightened reflexively, accustomed to the presence of someone who'd seen far more than he had. But Halden wasn't looking at him. He was looking at her. And what happened next caused the hallway's casual hum to thin into silence. The CSM's spine snapped straight, his chin lifting exactly 1 inch. A gesture of respect so sharp and so formal it froze the air itself. "Ma'am," he said, voice cutting through the hallway like a blade. "Good morning." Grayson's brow creased. He turned between them, baffled. "Sergeant Major, what are you?" But Halden didn't look at him. Not once. He held the young woman's gaze with the recognition of someone addressing an equal or a superior. She gave him a small nod, almost apologetic for the scene. And that was when Grayson felt it. A tiny crack in the certainty that had buoyed him moments before. The hallway had gone completely still. Officers emerged from doorways, conversations halted, eyes drifting toward the quiet confrontation unfolding in front of the division's most important room. But Grayson, unwilling to accept what was happening, forced a laugh. "Sergeant Major, you don't have to. Look, she's clearly confused. She thinks she belongs in the division briefing." Halden turned then. Slowly. His stare carried the weight of a man who had buried soldiers, mentored commanders, and served long enough to recognize a catastrophic mistake unfolding in real time. "Sir," he said sharply, "she's not confused." The lieutenant colonel felt something go cold behind his ribs. "Then who is she?" he demanded, voice smaller than he intended. The woman remained still, watching him with a calm that suddenly felt far more dangerous than defiance. But before she could answer, the heavy doors at the end of the hallway swung open, and everything Grayson thought he understood about the chain of command began to unravel. The double doors to the division briefing room opened with a slow, deliberate weight, the kind that made even seasoned officers straighten instinctively, and out stepped Major General Nathaniel Rowan, the commanding officer of the entire 17th Support Sustainment Division, flanked by 2 full-bird colonels and the division's executive staff. Their conversations drifted off mid-sentence when they saw her standing in the hallway, and the shift in the air was so immediate, so unmistakable, that even those who hadn't been watching now felt the gravity settling over them like a heavy cloak. The general's eyes locked onto the young woman, and the lines of his face, usually stern, rigid, reserved for battlefield updates and crisis reports, softened into something close to relief. "Colonel Hartman," he said, voice carrying through the corridor with the steady command of a man used to being obeyed. "Glad you could make it." And in that single moment, the last threads of Lieutenant Colonel Grayson's confidence snapped, leaving him standing motionless as the truth crashed into him with merciless clarity. "Colonel." His eyes darted to her shoulders as if he could force the insignia to appear, but she wasn't wearing her uniform today. She'd arrived early, planning to change after reviewing her notes. That, of course, had been the crack through which all his assumptions spilled. But the truth was now irrefutable. She wasn't a junior officer. She wasn't lost. She wasn't shadowing anyone. She was the division commander. Grayson's mouth opened with a quiet, strangled breath as the general continued, stepping toward her with a respect he rarely afforded even his senior staff. "We were waiting on your final review," Rowan added. "Colonel Hendricks was just about to brief your recommendations on the allocation changes." She nodded once, calm, assured, as though moments earlier she had not been talked down to like a wayward lieutenant. "Yes, sir," she replied, her voice level. "I'm prepared." The command sergeant major maintained his rigid posture beside her, every inch of his body language a shield thrown up in her defense. Soldiers passing by stared openly now, some whispering, others simply absorbing the tableau with wide eyes. But the loudest reaction came from the officers who knew exactly what this meant. Grayson had just condescended to the commanding officer of the entire division. Colonel Hartman finally turned toward him, her expression unreadable. No anger, no triumph. Only a quiet patience that somehow made the moment infinitely worse for him. "Lieutenant Colonel Grayson," she said, and hearing his name spoken with that calm authority was like feeling the floor drop out beneath him. "You were saying I didn't belong here?" Her voice wasn't sharp. It wasn't weaponized. But it cut him all the same, a clean incision through his pride. Grayson swallowed hard, the motion stiff and painfully visible, as though the truth he'd ignored earlier had become lodged in his throat. Around them, officers who had worked with him for years now looked at him differently, some in disbelief, others in disappointment, and a few with a sympathy that bordered on pity. The general turned his attention toward Grayson then, and the temperature in the hallway seemed to plunge several degrees. "Lieutenant Colonel," Rowan said, in a tone that brooked no misunderstanding. "Were you preventing Colonel Hartman from entering her own briefing?" The question hit with the force of a mortar. Grayson's mind raced for any lifeline. Procedural wording, a misunderstanding he could cling to, but there was nothing. "Sir, I didn't realize she wasn't in. I mean, there was no uniform, and she looked." He stopped abruptly, realizing he was about to finish this sentence with something that would bury him even deeper. Young, too confident, too quiet, too. Everything he had decided meant she could not possibly outrank him. The general's jaw tightened. "I see," he said, coldly. "So your assessment of who belongs in this room is based on appearance rather than roster or recognition of command authority?" The weight of the reprimand landed so heavily the hallway seemed to absorb it, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly in the tense silence. Grayson's face had drained of every hint of color, leaving him a pale, shaken silhouette amid the cluster of uniforms. Colonel Hartman watched him, not with malice, but with a depth of understanding that felt even heavier. "We've met before, Lieutenant Colonel," she said quietly, "at the Joint Logistics Conference last year. I briefed the sustainment restructuring plan." Another blow. Grayson's eyes widened in horror, memories slamming back into place. She had been there. She had been introduced. He had shaken her hand. But back then she'd been in uniform, a full-bird colonel standing beside generals and top-level staff. Back then, she had fit his idea of authority. "Ma'am," he whispered, the word escaping him like a confession. "There's no excuse." The general's gaze swept the gathered officers, imprinting the scene into every witness's memory. "Let this be a reminder," Rowan said, voice echoing off the polished floor. "That command is not a costume, and leadership is not measured by the assumptions we make about those around us. It is measured by competence, respect, and the ability to recognize both, even outside a uniform." Grayson nodded stiffly, trapped between humiliation and the dawning understanding of a lesson he should have learned decades earlier. "Report to my office after the briefing," Rowan finished. "We'll discuss your judgment, or lack thereof, at length." The general then turned back to Hartman, his voice softening instantly. "Colonel, shall we begin?" She offered a slight nod. "Yes, sir." And as she stepped past Grayson, he remained frozen in place, realizing with a hollow ache that he hadn't just made a mistake. He had misjudged a leader whose calm, quiet presence had been forged not from youth, but from capability powerful enough to command an entire division. And the worst part? She hadn't needed to raise her voice. She hadn't needed to outrank him with arrogance. She had simply stood there, confident, capable, and underestimated, and allowed the truth to reveal itself. It was the kind of revelation no officer forgot, especially not him. The briefing room felt different the moment Colonel Hartman stepped inside. Its polished walnut table, the neat rows of folders, the projection screens humming softly. Everything seemed to shift around her presence, as if the entire division staff instinctively recalibrated to the true center of gravity now that their commander was in the room. Officers who moments earlier had been talking in low clusters straightened in their seats, the rustle of uniforms falling into disciplined silence as she took her place at the head of the table. Lieutenant Colonel Grayson entered last, shoulders tight, jaw set in a grim line as he slid into a seat along the wall, no longer a participant, but an observer, one whose own misstep now hovered over the room like a quiet storm cloud. The lights dimmed as the first slide flickered onto the screen, revealing supply chain maps, personnel allocation charts, and readiness metrics shaped by months of her leadership. She spoke with clarity that cut cleanly through the air. No hesitation, no wavering, not a hint of the tension that had moments ago thickened the hallway. Instead, she briefed with the composed certainty of someone who had earned her position through results, not assumption. And as she outlined the adjustments she'd developed, redistributing maintenance platoons to ease operational bottlenecks, tightening convoy scheduling procedures, strengthening inter-brigade communications, you could see the shift in the room. Officers leaned forward, pens stopped tapping, conversations halted mid-thought. Even the cynical ones, the ones who had heard 1,000 briefings and believed nothing surprised them anymore, now watched her as someone whose mastery was undeniable. She didn't rush. She didn't brag. She simply led. And with every passing minute, The contrast between her professionalism and Grayson's earlier arrogance sharpened in the minds of everyone witnessing it. When she concluded and opened the floor for questions, the discussion became a flurry of structured inquiry. Commanders asking for clarifications, staff officers referencing specific data, the general occasionally interjecting with high-level considerations. Through it all, she responded with precision, not once faltering, effortlessly weaving operational knowledge with strategic foresight in a way only a commander deeply rooted in her division could. Grayson watched from his seat, the shame settling deeper into his expression, but something else flickered there too: understanding, regret, the quiet, painful acknowledgement that everything he had assumed about her had been built on a foundation of his own narrow expectations. When the briefing finally wrapped, the general dismissed the staff, who filtered out in subdued clusters, murmuring about adjustments to their operations, and the commanding officer, who had just proven why she held the title she did. Hartman gathered her notes calmly, but before leaving, she approached Grayson, who stood stiffly, as though preparing to be reprimanded again. She stopped a few feet away, her posture relaxed but her eyes steady. "Lieutenant Colonel," she said softly, and though her voice lacked anger, it carried the full weight of what had transpired. He swallowed, his reply quiet. "Ma'am, I can't express how sorry I am. I misjudged you, and well, it's not something I'll forget. It was unprofessional, and it was wrong." She regarded him for a long moment, not with superiority, but with something closer to disappointment touched by a deeper understanding. "People underestimate others all the time," she said. "But the real issue isn't the mistake, it's what comes after, what you choose to learn from it." His shoulders eased, fractionally. "Ma'am, I won't make that mistake again. With anyone." She nodded once, accepting the sincerity in his voice. "Good. Because in this job, assumptions can cost more than pride. They can cost soldiers." Her words weren't sharp, but they landed with the weight of truth he could not deny. The general reappeared in the doorway then, signaling for Grayson to follow him to the private meeting they both knew would be difficult, yet necessary. "Sir," Hartman added before they left, "he understands what went wrong. Let him start from that place." Rowan held her gaze for a moment, then gave a small, approving nod, an acknowledgement of her leadership not just in strategy, but in character. As Grayson walked past her, he paused. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Not for leniency, not for forgiveness, but for the lesson, one she had delivered without cruelty, without humiliation, with only the weight of truth and the example of what real command looked like." When he and the general disappeared down the hall, Hartman finally stepped outside, the sun settling over the base in a warm, late-morning glow. Soldiers moved across the courtyard with crisp purpose, saluting her as she passed, each gesture a reminder of the responsibility she carried and the standards she upheld. Word of the morning's event had already begun to ripple through the installation, not as gossip, but as a story, a parable almost, about misjudgment, professionalism, and the unexpected ways humility takes root. Some would whisper that Grayson had underestimated her. Others would say he simply failed to see what was right in front of him. But those who paid closer attention understood the deeper truth. Leadership isn't defined by age, appearance, or assumption. Leadership is defined by presence, by composure, by a quiet authority that doesn't need to announce itself to be felt. And as the division commander walked back toward her office, calm, steady, unshaken, the lesson lingered in the air long after she was gone. An unspoken reminder that the greatest leaders don't demand respect. They earn it so effortlessly that those who once doubted them find themselves changed simply by witnessing the truth.